What's going on, everyone? Today we're going to cover the game between Alireza and Magnus Carlsen, played in round 11 of the Meltwater Champions Chess Tour. Let's just jump straight into the game. Alireza starts with white and he goes for d4, and Magnus responds with pawn to d5. And this is already a big surprise because usually Magnus goes for knight to f6 or even e6 against d4. But d5 is already a move that Magnus has not played a lot in his career. Here, knight to f3, knight to f6, e3 by Alireza, and Magnus plays bishop to f5, developing this bishop that a lot of times gets stuck behind the pawn chain if e6 is ever played. But now this pawn on d5 and pawn on b7 can come under attack after a quick c4 and queen to b3. So let's see how Alireza decides to play this position. He goes here for pawn to c4, Magnus responds with pawn to c6, protecting the pawn, and here instead of queen to b3 directly putting pressure on both pawns, he goes for knight to c3, and now queen to b3 is really a threat. So Magnus solves that problem by playing pawn to a6, and he wants to go b5 as quickly as possible, and here Alireza challenges this bishop on f5 right away with knight to h4. Here Magnus continues with bishop to g4, not allowing this knight to gain tempo on this bishop, and now the bishop is instead gaining tempo on this queen, so the queen goes to c2. Notice that if you go for moves like pawn to f3, bishop to g4, and g4, thinking, okay, I'm gonna go ahead and take this bishop after, well, you've weakened your entire pawn structure, and it's gonna be very hard for this king to go and castle in either direction. So instead of this, after queen to c2, we have pawn to g6. Now Magnus wants to develop this bishop to g7 and castle kingside as quickly as possible, while this knight is offside a little bit. Here h3, bishop to e6, and notice that yes, this bishop is getting in front of this pawn, but it's not a big problem because you're going to develop this bishop to this diagonal, and you don't need to move this pawn in order to develop the bishop in this diagonal. So after this move, we have pawn to c5. Alireza chooses to close the queen side a little bit, but now, as you will see in the future, this pawn is going to come under attack after moves like knight to b to d7 and pawn to b6, and it's going to be very hard to keep this structure together. So after c5, Magnus continues to develop his bishop with bishop to g7. Here we have bishop to d3, knight b to d7, and f4. And this looks very scary because these pawns are coming in very quickly. Moves like g4, pawn to f5, trapping this bishop are coming quite fast. So Magnus needs to do something really dramatic right now, and he goes for pawn to b6, as we mentioned, undermining the pawn chain, and at the same time, if pawn takes, trying to go c5 and maybe liberate his position a little bit. So after f5, pawn took on f5, pawn took on b6, and here Magnus goes for c5. At the moment, this pawn is hanging, this pawn is hanging, and there's threats of maybe even pawn to c4 in this position. So Alireza goes for bishop takes on f5, and Magnus takes on b6. Now, if bishop takes on e6, the queen can capture back on e6, and you don't have to damage your pawn structure with pawn takes on e6. Here, the game continues, knight to a4, and Magnus very quickly responds, queen to a4. Now this king can no longer castle because you cannot cross through the check, and at the same time, there's a lot of pressure here. So Alireza returns with the bishop, and Magnus instantaneously plays queen to b8. A very good example of why you should always think on your opponent's time. The idea is that Magnus wants to give a check here and maybe take this knight. Of course, at the moment, that's not really possible because you go queen to f2 and you protect everything. But considering how bad these pieces are, they're all over each other, this could be good for Magnus. And look at these two knights on the edge of the board. They don't make a really good impression. So Alireza solves this problem by castling kingside himself, and here Magnus plays queen to g3, knight to f5, and Magnus took on f5 with the bishop. And notice that this bishop that was really bad in front of this pawn has now traded itself. So not a bad position here. Bishop took on f5 and pawn to e6, and Magnus's pawn structure is a little bit better than white's pawn structure. Here, rook to f3, Alireza is content with going for a draw by repetition here, considering his king is very weak. This rook can come to g8 at any moment, bishop can come to h6, and chaos could happen here on the king side. But he goes for rook to f3, pretty much asking Magnus, hey, I want to draw, what are you going to do about it? So Magnus goes for queen to e1 check, the rook returns to f1, and Magnus goes back to g3, and Alireza again plays rook to f3. Now, if Magnus repeats the position again, it will be a 3-4 repetition, so he has to play a different move, and he goes for queen to h4, but Alireza continues to harass the queen with rook to f4. And in this position, Magnus plays queen to h5, and he should have gone for a draw, because this not loses, but gives Alireza the opportunity to take the advantage in the game by playing these piece sacrifice, pawn takes on c5, sacrificing the bishop on f5. Now, if you take the bishop, you simply go pawn to c6, and this knight doesn't have a lot of squares. If you go back to b8, then we continue pushing the pawn forward, and we're gaining tempo by attacking the knight, and we're going to queen on the next move, winning the game. And if the knight comes to e5, then we can take rook takes on f5 with a double attack on both the queen and the knight, and this will be just absolutely winning by Alireza. And he misses this chance of taking this advantage and winning like in this style. So instead, after queen to h5, he goes for bishop to d3, missing the entire combination in the position. And here Magnus absolutely takes over. He plays pawn to c4. Now this bishop has to continue to retreat. He goes bishop to e2, and Magnus goes for queen to g6, offering a trade of queens. Alireza takes that opportunity, but now after h takes on g6, Magnus completely fixes his pawn structure. And if you know anything about Magnus, you know that he's the king of endgames. And with only 2 pawn islands and this very strong pawn chain, together with the 3 pawn islands by white, Magnus has a little bit of an advantage, and usually that's all he needs to start pushing. Here, Alireza improves his knight that was doing nothing here on a4, brings it back to c3, and maybe there's ideas of playing e4, undermining this very nice pawn structure that Magnus has at the moment. Here, Magnus continues with castle, pawn to h4. The idea of this move is that you want to prevent some g5 and maybe g4 gaining space by black. So you go h4, now g5 is no longer a move. Knight comes to h5. Now, if you want to take here, then you simply improve the position by black, because the pawn can take, then this king can come to h7, bishop to h6, and you open up the g file in order to attack. Plus, this knight's going to be coming to f6, and it's going to have a very juicy square here on g4. So Alireza does not go for this, and he goes for rook to f2. And I don't really understand this move. Maybe coming all the way back to f1 or maybe even to f3 would have been better, preventing this knight jump to g3 like Magnus does. So Magnus goes knight to g3, Alireza goes bishop to d1. He doesn't want to give this bishop away. Rook comes to b8, and notice that Magnus just completely took over this game. He's the one attacking on both sides of the board now. King to h2, Alireza attacks the knight goes to f5, and not only does it attack this pawn, but it's going to relocate itself to d6, and now it's going to hide the square on e4 after this knight comes to f6. So we have king to h3, Alireza protects the pawn with the very impressive king move to h3. Magnus goes knight to f6, and here g4 by Alireza, and Magnus takes this opportunity to create the impressive bind on the square on e4 by playing f5. Alireza took on f5, g takes on f5, opening up the g file for the rook for some counterplay. Rook to g2 is played. Magnus plays king to h7, getting away from this nasty pin, and b3 by Alireza. He needs to activate his pieces somehow. Now the big threat is just simply bishop to a3, taking advantage of this nasty pin. So Magnus goes rook f to c8, not only getting away from the pin, but now there's this cover attacks here with pawn takes, attacking the knight on c3. So Alireza took on c4, Magnus took with the rook, and notice now how all these pieces are combining together to attack the white pieces here, and just the white side doesn't make a lot of sense at the moment. So Alireza goes from knight to e2, and Magnus plays a very instructive move here. Instead of improving his rook on b8, maybe doubling the rooks here, he plays this quiet bishop to h6. And what's the idea of this move? Well, this knight was heading for this very juicy square on f4, targeting the pawn on e6. So now if the knight gets there, the bishop can take, and then you're dropping the pawn on d4 as well. So Alireza couldn't do that. Instead, he goes for bishop to b3, attacking the rook. The rook retreats to c7. We have bishop to d2. Alireza is trying to get his pieces out somehow. This knight comes to f6, and now, as we mentioned, both of these knights are attempting to occupy the square on e4, and plus another knight could occupy the square on g4, which would be absolutely very nice. So after rook to c1, Magnus trades one of the rooks, knight takes, and here comes the knight to e4. knight back to d3, and knight to g4, and now there's a double attack on the pawn on e3. So Alireza protects with the rook, but Magnus wins the pawn now by bishop takes on e3 in this position. The rook comes to e2, and now there's this temporary pin that you cannot really take on d4 with the bishop, because you take on e6 with the rook, and then these pawns are going to be very weak. This bishop is going to be able to take on d5, and maybe white is not that bad if that were to happen. So Magnus just keeps the position like it is. At the moment, this bishop is not the rook is not really taking anything, and it's not really attacking anything, because this knight is very hard to remove from this position. So instead, Magnus just improves by playing rook to b6, and now he's getting ready to take here because the rook protects laterally on e6 here. So knight to c5, pretty much the same idea. You cannot take because then the pawn on e6 is dropping. So it is a little bit premature to do it at the moment. So Magnus improves his position yet again with king to g6. Is preparing to come king to f7, and then this pawn is going to be well protected, and then you can go ahead and capture the one on d4. So here, Alireza goes king to g3, king to f7 by Magnus. You have to be a bit careful. And when you're playing fast games like bullet, maybe blitz games, one idea that you always want to keep in mind when your opponent has a knight is that you want to keep your king and whatever piece is near your king on opposite color squares. So notice that this rook is on a dark square and the king is on a light square. That means that this knight cannot fork those two pieces. If they were on the same squares, for example, this king had come to f6, then they're both on dark squares, then this knight can give a check and pick up the rook. So just keep that in mind whenever you're playing an endgame. Keep your king and whatever piece is hanging around your king on opposite color squares, and there can never be a fork in the position. Here, Alireza continues with knight to d7 anyway, attacking the rook, and Magnus plays this beautiful rook to b4. And the position is absolutely lost for white here. This bishop's going to take on d4 no matter what, or the rook is going to take on d4. But in this position, Alireza overstepped his time and lost on time. Believe it or not, the speed demon Alireza loses on time. Incredible. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed this game. Magnus continues to show Alireza that, aside from bullet, he is the best player in the world, and that Alireza still has a lot to learn from him. Hope you guys stay well. As always, stay safe. Have a great day. Show respect to your opponent. See you on the next one.